Good afternoon, everyone. This is an exciting time. We are now 2 panels past lunch, so lunch has worn off. It's still beautiful outside, and the sun is up later now, so it'll still be beautiful later when we go to our reception. Our role on this panel is to kind of broaden the question a little bit. Housing is one important aspect of the local community planning process, and to try and put that in a little larger context. I think I'd be remiss in some of my scholarship if I didn't at least offer a symbolic defense of Proposition 13 after the last panel. There are some positive side effects of Prop 13, not the least of which is your property taxes probably are lower than they otherwise would be. And if you're talking about housing affordability, that obviously is one of the key components. But anyway, that aside, what we're going to do in this session is just kind of have an opening conversation about what tools are out there and what avenues. But the broader question, we've talked a lot about housing and quality of life in communities and how housing is sort of this key to entering the middle class and individual wealth and economic opportunity. But the other part of that is jobs and employment and where people actually work. And a lot of the conversation we hear about transportation is really that connection. How do I get from work to home and back? And so what I'm hoping we can accomplish in this panel is to kind of broaden that conversation and think about some of the trade-offs that come as we focus on housing. To start the session, I'd just love for each of the panelists to kind of introduce themselves and kind of the lens that they're bringing to this conversation.
Should I start? Yeah. My name's James Braswell. I'm the managing editor of a website called Planetizen, which is a national planning and land use website. Should I keep going? Yeah. Okay.
No, actually, let's go ahead and introduce everybody.
Sure. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Daflos. I am Mayor Garcetti's Chief Innovation Officer in the city of Los Angeles.
My name is Michael Lewin, and I'm a law professor at Toro Law School in Long Island, so I'm the one non-Californian here.
I'm Alicia Matricardi. I'm Director of Real Estate and General Counsel for a nonprofit called New Economics for Women based in Los Angeles.
And she comes from a great family, by the way. My name is Nestor Enrique Valencia. I'm a councilman with the city of Bell, resident for many, many years. But my real job is healthcare administration.
Excellent. Well, as you can see, we've got a lot of different perspectives at the table. I wanted you to get that context because what I thought would be interesting is to start off with each of the panelists answering the question of the session. How can cities be planned for economic opportunity? And I think the emphasis here is on what can we do better. So with that, maybe James, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. It's a large question, and I spend almost all day, every day, thinking about planning, not just in the city of Los Angeles, but all over the country. And there are so many intersections that the professional and academic field of planning has with other fields. It's really hard to identify one area that can have the most economic development benefit. But I think that it's important. I'll just mention one big initiative in the city of Los Angeles right now, which is to rewrite the zoning code. And that is, I think, what a lot of people working at the city, especially on the 6th floor in the planning department, would tell you is the most likely vehicle for potential change in the future. They're rewriting the entire zoning code for the first time since, I think, 1946. And that coincides with the rollout of an initiative to update every single community plan. I think the number is 26 community plans in the entire city within the next 6 years. And this comes from the Measure S fallout, which was a result of the Michael Weinstein funding. And to tie it, I just have to tie it all together. It's so amazing that Brent mentioned that, because Michael Weinstein's lawyer sued me for libel once for a story I wrote with Jennifer as the main source. So, but he backed off that charge because the truth usually wins out in libel cases. But this is potentially, and it's a major reform of zoning codes and the approach to zoning code. And you heard the mention of Euclidean zoning earlier. This is going to be a hybrid form and land use code. And as they roll out these community plans all over the city, that's when these new zoning code is going to be implemented. So the question really is going to be answered in the next 6 years, whether the city of Los Angeles, and specifically the planning department of the city of Los Angeles, is capable of delivering the kinds of change through planning that they say they want to accomplish. That's it for me.
Ann?
Sure. Well, on that note, so I'm representing the mayor's office, and in my office, one of the things that we do, or we get the opportunity to do, is look at sort of, as innovation might mean, look at what the city might anticipate to be true in the future. And so one of the things that we spent a good number of years on now is looking at really the question of accessory dwelling units, which sounds like it has been talked about in the previous panels. But yes, I can try. Let me know if it doesn't work. Sometimes it just doesn't work, but I'll do my best. So one of the things that we've been looking at is accessory dwelling units. And as has been discussed, one of the things at the state level has really been to modify the laws at the state level, and a lot of the work that sort of formed some version of the groundwork for that has come out of Los Angeles. And in 2015, if we were to be having that conversation, which we were having that conversation in 2015, the discussion looked quite different than it looks now. And part of that is because we believe there's a continuously growing awareness of the fact that certainly Los Angeles needs more housing. And our mayor and our city has continued to think that accessory dwelling units are not the only answer, but they are one part of the answer to helping a lot of things. One is co-locating families, giving people options. So they're often called granny flats. There's a reason why they're called granny flats. They're called in-law units, and they're called all of those things. But we sort of continue to see that as one big area of opportunity for the city. The other thing that it does, to the point of how you connect housing with economic opportunity, I think it's probably no secret that the future will look different than the past, particularly when it comes to jobs, particularly when we think about automation and what that's going to mean for jobs. So whereas my office was looking at housing a few years ago and has become sort of as famous as you can be for a project like accessory dwelling units, now we're looking at the future of work. And not only what that means for Angelenos, but what that means for the city, what that means for how we do work, what that means for transportation. There's something like, I think I heard the GM of Ford had mentioned in a meeting that I was in, that there are something like 80 million parking spots in the world, or in the country, and then the number of cars is far fewer than the number of parking spots. So if we were to think about the math of things like that, when it comes to the future of work, when it comes to where cars will park, when it comes to what jobs will be available, those kinds of conversations are things, when it comes to economic opportunity, that we think we need to be connecting to housing. So that's a little bit of what we're doing and how we're thinking about it.
Excellent. Michael?
So I'm not going to pretend to be the world's leading expert on economic development, and I would talk about housing, but I think really everything I was going to say has been said by somebody else. So, but the earlier panelists made me think a lot more about transit. So there are a few questions I wanted to ask and maybe answer. So one question is, do we really have to build just where there's transit? And to me, the answer is, in the context of major league housing scarcity, such as what you have in Southern California or Northern California, probably not. The needs are probably too vast. Another question that maybe is more controversial in this room is, well, how much do we care about transit? Is transit hopeless? And if I was just looking at it from a Los Angeles lens, I could understand why people might think that's so. I did a little, while I was listening to the panels, I was also playing with my phone and looking at the American Public Transportation Association's ridership numbers. And in Los Angeles, ridership didn't just go down for the past year or two, it's gone down about 15% since 2010, which means it didn't even have like the early 10s boom that some places had. But, key point, even in California, Los Angeles is not typical. So, for example, San Diego, not exactly known as a poster boy for public transit. Ridership up since 2010. San Francisco, not, I think, known as the most well-known public transit system in the world from the gossip I've heard. Ridership up. So there's something very specifically wrong in Los Angeles. I don't know what it is, but I suspect those of you who are Angelenos might know something I don't.
I do.
There you go. And then the third question I thought about is more transit-oriented, more compact development inconsistent with widespread home ownership, which apparently people like very much, even in this room as in many other rooms. And so looking at trusty Wikipedia, I discovered the United States home ownership rate 64%. So if you might think, well, surely every other more compact countries have lower home ownership rates. Fake news. France higher, 65%. Israel higher, 67%. Canada higher, 67%. Netherlands, for God's sake, higher, 67%. Finland, 72%. Well, you get the idea. So it's actually easier to own home, or certainly in some sense easier to own homes in lots of other countries. I think the difference is in the United States, people tend to think of a home, an owned house, as a single family house detached on a large lot with nothing else. And so in most of the United States, you're either living in an apartment, whether it's a garden apartment or a high rise or something in between, or you are living in a detached single family suburb-like house. But the rest of the world, it's more like New York or Philadelphia. You have much more of an in-between mix. You have more attached row houses, townhouses, whatever you want to call them, more in-between forms of housing that are still ownership. So on that note, I'll let the next panelist talk.
So how can we combine housing with, or housing can be built specific to enhancing economic opportunity is the question of the panel. And New Economics for Women has been seeking answers to that question for the past 26 years. So as a nonprofit, the organization exists to spark economic mobility for our lowest income earners, particularly in Los Angeles. We've concentrated our work in the city of Los Angeles because we used parcels that were available through city agencies historically in order to build affordable housing. We now have 15 discrete housing developments throughout the city. We're responsible for 4,000 people's sweet dreams at night. And Rick Cole said we don't speak about housing in terms of units, but as he knows in the industry, we do it all the time. We have 1,400 units of housing and over 150,000 square feet of commercial spaces built into the housing and in adjacencies. So for us, what is housing without economic mobility and economic opportunities? It's single-family housing or it's multifamily housing aimed at higher wages. So in order to spark that economic mobility and really provide opportunities for people to move up the economic ladder and strengthen the middle class, which is a part of the work that we do, we focus on mobility as it relates to how you relate to your housing. So we design from the perspective of the working mother, particularly the single mother, who needs to man the fort in the kitchen while watching the little ones, while perhaps doing jobs, working on her computer or on her phone, or home-based childcare opportunities. And we think about those uses of housing as we build affordable housing for our client base. Another aspect that is very important to us in terms of sparking that economic mobility is looking at workforce and wages. And how do we accommodate housing built around the fact that wage stagnation will not allow us enough rents to continue the replicability of housing. So we have tried to partner with larger workforce development programs so that we're not only building the housing, but we're able to spark that mobility through partnerships and direct relationships. Whether if job opportunities are not in our own buildings, we're looking at adjacencies to make sure that a family is strengthened through the dignity of work. And finally, something that we grapple with and we're not talking enough about is we lack housing professionals. We have a complete dearth of recruits as project managers, real estate associates, even on the real estate brokerage side, shocking as that may be to some of the commercial folks in the building. We need more, and I'm so pleased to be here under the dean's leadership at a graduate school, because we need more qualified housing professionals to think broadly about these problems, to understand pro formas, and to put fingertips to the Excel spreadsheet that will help us to produce analysis analyses to move forward in housing. I can't tell you the lack of qualified applicants that we have for these positions, and it directly affects our output in a meaningful way. So another idea.
Well, I can first tell you, a little background on the City of Bell. For those who don't know, the City of Bell is located, and maybe some of you do, in a bad way. But we're talking good. We're all positive now.
That's right.
It's almost coming up to 10 years, believe it or not. It's a new Bell, but it's kind of the old Bell too. We have census-wise 35,000 people. Really, it's 40,000 people, and we live in a 2-mile by 1-mile radius. Low income, definitely low income. I've made my stake because I grew up there. Alicia spoke about bringing it all down to the family. I happen to be a legislator as a council member, but I also happen to be a single father, raising 2 daughters, one now in college, one at the local high school. And we lost our house during the recession and after the scandal, don't do public service. There is a sense in my council, there's a sense in my community that we have to have economic development in a city that was neglected. And it's a small city, but I don't think we're not unlike other small cities in LA County or even California. There has been a complete stoppage of economic development for whatever reason. I don't know. My real job's in healthcare. We can talk about that all night. But in Bell, it just didn't happen. So now the new council, and this is after now 8 council members, because some have lost elections. I continue in my second term. I could say that to do economic development, we had to invest. The city had to buy property in our major cross-section, Gage and Atlantic. We're buying property tomorrow for $2.2 million, but the owner got it for $800,000 just a few years ago. So it's making it very difficult for cities like us to do economic, but we need to do it. The way we did it in Bell, we got a brewery from San Diego, and it's packed. Every Friday, every Saturday, even Sunday evening, there is a lot of people coming. Is there parking? Absolutely not. And there won't be. We're lucky, we're next to a freeway, but honestly, that doesn't help us. That just makes our community devalued and marginalized. But we are getting the eco line, going from downtown Union Station all the way to somewhere in Orange County. Artesia, to be exact. And the housing, we have a housing authority, BCHA, but we can't make it work. We're deficient every year. There needs to be some changes where we can invest in those properties without giving them to the wolves of the developers or the wolves of profit, over families. I'm big on that. I have 19 units in the city of Bell that are just sitting there that could be used for families. And I can't do it because the political will is not there. They wanted to sell it to some commercial vendor who's going to make rents at $1,800 for one bedroom, when they're right now paying about $800, $900. On the positive side, we did fast track 64 permanent units for veterans and homelessness in the city of Bell. It took longer to put the furniture in than it took to build the actual 64 units. But that was in our industrial area. No neighbors, really. And it was right in front of our shelter. So it made a lot of sense. But boy, did it take a lot of moving and pushing and breaking knees 4 council members, no way, no way. We need warehouses there. We need jobs there. So where's that balance? Well, we broke a few knees and called a few spouses and girlfriends and boyfriends and said, get them to vote yes. And we got those permanent housing. But we're still lacking more housing in the city of Bell, Maywood, Cudahy. That area, we call it Celita, Southeast LA. Just a little start off.
Excellent. I guess, we've heard a lot of suggestions and a lot of conversation about possibilities and some really interesting and innovative ideas. I guess question for this panel, and I'll kind of throw it open to the panel. What are the most promising approaches to dealing both with the housing but also with preserving that balance and quality of life with jobs? What are kind of the most promising options that you can think of?
To me, there's one unequivocal answer to that, and it touches on something that Michael was talking about earlier. Public transit is, and research shows this again and again, this isn't just my opinion, public transit is the most effective economic mobility tool that we have. If we're investing in buses that run frequently and move at a relatively swift pace down the road, it empowers everyone that lives in the community to have access to jobs, to move around freely, to run their errands. It's the most effective economic mobility tool we have. And the reason why it's not succeeding in Los Angeles is there are a few reasons. One is the displacement of populations that rely on transit to get to and from work. The vehicle miles traveled statistics are skewing towards suburban, low income, and youth demographics now in the region. And the other reason is because we invest in half-baked transit infrastructure. Light rail lines that wait for cars to turn left, and buses that have to turn out on the street and re-enter traffic every time they pick or drop somebody off. And it's half-baked, I said that. And it's not just transit, it's also bike infrastructure. There was an article in the LA Times on the opinion page last week that called the My Figueroa bike lane project that was promised as a leader of the complete streets infrastructure potential when it was first pitched 10 years ago. The writer in the LA Times is absolutely correct to describe it as a monument to half-baked efforts. That's the kind of product that we're actually putting out once we get done with all these political processes and in capitulating to single-car commuters. and we know, everyone knows very well that if we build a robust and public transit system that prioritizes users, that we will deliver massive economic mobility benefits. We just don't do it.
I'll say something with regard to mass transit. We're excited about getting the Eco Line. I don't know, I'm sure some of you have kids. My kids are not eager to get a license. They're not like I was. I was driving illegally at 12. And, among other things, but my college 19-year-old, no doubt, I don't want to drive. Well, you need to because I'm not going to go back and forth, Long Beach. But they're not looking forward to that. They don't want to, and I think that's a positive. If we could get more mass transit, if we could get some sensible bus lines, small and large. We have a small little transit, 2 little buses that go around the city of Bell and hit up, schools and high schools and our little downtown. And it costs 25 cents to 50 cents to ride. And when it breaks down, we get calls. So there's a need. There's also the need of finding jobs. In our community, they're not really anxious to come out to Santa Monica or Culver City to get jobs. Maybe LA, but that's still that quality of life. Being in commute times, an hour to get to downtown from Bell, 7 miles. doesn't sound sensible. It was not sensible coming over here, you know, it took me 2 hours. But here we are, right? So there's going to be a family economic need to do the job, but we need to do better. We need to do better on that regard.
Michael, I will say in regards to scalable innovations for housing, we'd be remiss if we don't talk about construction typologies as well, right? So part of the industry's movement towards modular or manufactured or shipping containers has been pretty hot. But as a developer, I will share the use of shipping containers that are manufactured overseas and are brought here to this country cannot be used in a way that can scale decent options for the production of affordable housing, because unless they are rated by engineers and there's a stamp on the shipping container, they can't be reused unless they're taken apart so that localities can review whether or not they're structurally sound. So then you've got the waste of doing that. On the modular and the manufactured side, modular housing is something that we've used for single family homes, and we're looking at greater replicability and shortening our development time. Modular can be a little pricey when a locality doesn't understand how to purpose it among other stick-built designs. That was a very difficult learning curve for us within the city of Los Angeles, and one that begs us to never do it again. But I think that the industry will get there. We're just not there right now. And manufactured housing is something that many other states utilize, but California generally does not see manufactured as an alternative, as a quicker, cheaper method of building housing. And manufactured has a lot of pluses. It can actually, if you build it lowered into the ground, it will look more like the approach of a single-family dwelling stick-built that we're all familiar with. It's just built to a HUD code, and it's on a vehicular chassis, if you will. But those typologies, as the innovations come up, I think we're going to see a lot more of those if we can get to scale by getting out of the way of the use of some of those from a permitting and a financing perspective. I think we can have quicker replicability of cheaper housing. And that's not to say that we don't need zoning changes to be able to do that, and a little bit of an education process so that YIMBYs will also accept modular and manufactured and shipping container housing. But I think those are really promising construction typologies that we should be paying attention to in the next decade.
I was going to ask, where do you put them?
Anywhere. Yeah, anywhere. The difficulty is not the typology, it's in the neighborhood as to whether or not it will accept the typology. But from a building standpoint, you can do multi-story dwelling units with that type. Other countries do it all the time. Even other countries who also have earthquakes, we're not so unique in that particular danger. We're just not paying attention to it. I don't think we're thinking broadly enough about it. And there's a lot of concerns as to whether or not it will degrade the community by adding in lower income folks. I don't think there's any other way around it. Modular housing has a bad rep, and that has to change in order for us to get to scale for quicker housing options in the state.
There's a company in Texas pushing 3D printing as an affordable housing solution also. So I think you're going to start seeing that more.
Well, one thing I wonder is, and because both in this panel and earlier panels, I've heard a lot of talk about construction costs. I know from other scholarships, especially an essay by Edward Glazer, I think the title is Why is Manhattan So Expensive? He emphasizes that in low-cost cities like a Dallas or in Atlanta, housing costs are pretty close to construction costs. But in high-cost cities, they're way ahead of construction costs. So I wonder to what extent are construction costs a problem here, and to what extent are scarcity and land costs a bigger driver?
As a developer, part of our construction cost is litigation, permitting. Those are the unknown factors that can drive our pro forma bananas, and those are the kinds of factors that we should all be very conscientious to be able to rein in, and should be able to use public policy to solve for that. The construction industry will get us to the lowest cost of lumber, and that is not necessarily our public policy concern when we're looking at scaling up for thousands, hundreds of thousands of housing units. We need to concentrate our efforts on the ability to remove challenges to something like a manufactured housing and drive scale quickly. And so I think those unknowns are something that we need to get in line and be very transparent about discussing as they affect our ability to build, because litigation and the cost of permitting, the literal cost of permitting, can kill our deal. And the idea that a city would exact its fee on housing so that they can try to build more housing is counterintuitive and very dangerous as a public policy problem.
When you heard Rick Cole talking about building materials and form, what
Yes.
was your reaction to that it was going to make it a lot more difficult?
In the lunchtime panel? No, in the sense that, we also believe in a livable wage, and we believe in paying fair wages. We believe in Section 3 goals, but if the housing's cost to build limits the ability to build in the first place, then what are we left to do? Then find typologies that are perhaps not able or do not have to use that prevailing wage requirement for on-site development. And I think that's a disgusting approach to build more housing, but it's one of the last things we have left to be able to move our communities into housing in the first place.
Sorry.
No.
And I want to step way back because, we're talking a lot of technical knowledge and a lot of specifics. I went into government, I was living a comfortable life, being a healthcare administrator with your dad, and surfing and playing ice hockey and raising a family. And before I got into public service, I made a conscious decision that government was not a business. That government is a service. And if you take the profits, the extreme profits that people want to make out of building, construction, real estate, I really think we're going to have and get to affordable housing. If we start looking at building materials that make more sense here in California. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Yosemite, of all places, and they were talking about cellulosic nanomaterial, which is like a blend of wood and concrete. That's very, very strong, apparently. I don't know all the specifics yet, but it sounded awesome, it sounded affordable, and it sounded strong. At the end of the day, in my community, we need to be proud of our communities. We need to be proud of where we live and how we live. It's important that we build decent housing. And affordability is going to come from taking out those rules that say, you know what, I'm going to flip that property. I'm going to buy it for $800,000 and then I'll sell it to whoever at $2.2 million. Something there needs to happen where government steps in and says, okay, you know what, we need the regulation. I know some of you may not agree with regulation, but in some cases we need it, just like we do in healthcare.
So I think one of the questions, though, is how do you, first, how do you get the political will? I think that was part of the last panel. But, I mean, it seems to me there's this sense. I mean, if you go back to 2011 when Governor Brown killed RDAs in California and he took all the money that was sitting there, most of the money that was sitting there was for housing, right? There was an earmarked portion of redevelopment monies that had to go into housing funds. And most jurisdictions went out and chased retail or chased kind of those export-oriented jobs with high wages and left those funds sitting there. And so I guess one question is, do we think we've crossed the threshold where those kinds of innovations are possible, where in fact, if resources were available, I mean, there's a lot of bills in the legislature, but how many of those will get passed and how many of those will get funded? Versus all of the people, I mean, when Ventura County had an election recently, we put in place again our growth boundary, which everybody who lives there and owns a house says, wonderful, my house is now more valuable. And that whole list of vested self-interests from Chuck's presentation this morning, how do you overcome that kind of momentum in that system?
I guess I can maybe offer a perspective. I think one of the things that I've observed in now 4 years working inside the city of Los Angeles, previously I was in the private sector, but working with government clients for more than a decade. What I've observed is that one thing that can be really helpful, both for the structure of government and the bureaucracy, but then also, right, because the bureaucracy is actually there for some really great reasons, which is it protects people. It makes sure that homes don't fall down. It makes sure that homes are built in the right places. Right places, I recognize that that's subjective. But it has really good purposes. That said, I think one observation has been that, pilots and small examples of maybe things that could be considered a little bit wild, can actually be really effective, because I think they can really help the bureaucracy get comfortable. They can test out new rules. They can also help residents get more comfortable. It's not always the right answer, but I think what I've observed is that things that perhaps were really controversial even just a few years ago now there's more appetite to try things out. And that's because we're trying to learn as we go, and we're trying to change things more subtly than by just quickly doing something and offsetting the bureaucracy. Because the bureaucracy's been there a long time, and it helps people just get comfortable. There's a few really good examples of that, I think particularly in the housing space. And I'm really hopeful about some of the things that have been discussed around modular, around the 3D printing. That's not ready for prime time. It's probably not even ready for pilot time. But it does seem like there are some good inroads, and I actually think that those things are happening because these other things have started. And you're seeing really good examples of those pilots being impactful. Portland, Oregon's a great example of a place where, again, 5 or 6 years ago, the kinds of conversations that they were having were not at the place they are now. Vancouver, Washington, a great place to look at. Places in Colorado. Now, none of those places are California, and our rules are different here, and our expectations are different here. But I think they're places where sort of the value of pilots has been helpful. The other thing, and coincidentally I heard someone in the lobby say the word that I was going to say, which is, so wherever you are, we're on the same page, which is incentives. That's something that my office has been thinking a lot about. We tend to come at a lot of conversations, whether it's economic opportunity, whether it's housing, whatever it is. We often tend to come, I think, as government, to the table from the point of view of penalizing you. So you don't pay your taxes, we'll find you. But we're probably not going to find you to give you a refund, as my husband, who's also in government, likes to say. We're good at taking money, not giving money. We're good at saying no, not yes. But wouldn't it be great if actually we could think about it from the point of view of incentivizing? And wouldn't it be better if we could think about it from the point of view of how do we create economic opportunity in the wallets of everybody that's sitting here, as if you're a homeowner or not? And I think some of the solutions that think about it from that point of view may have promise, because you're, particularly if you're incentivizing people who are homeowners to do the right thing, if you will, and build differently, add to their home, create housing for those that might be homeless. I hope to see that that's the direction where we're headed. And I think, again, there are some really good examples, actually in LA, of that happening, and people saying, maybe we shouldn't think about this from the no point of view, but what if it was, yes, and also maybe sometimes no, but like more on the yes side. And again, I think just helping Angelenos build wealth and Angelenos get more. Because, by the way, one of the questions that was asked earlier was why is it harder here? We tend to have a population. I was pulling up some of the numbers, but our population makes less money than most populations in big cities. Our average median income is about $30,000. That, compared to the national average, is quite a bit lower, on the order of about $19,000. We have a bigger city than most cities, so we have some things that make certainly Los Angeles unique, but then also California is unique in all the ways it sounds like have been discussed already today. But I wanted to offer those two things with pilots and incentives as a place to start, or another place to start in the conversation.
I think part of this conversation is the shift from the middle class to the income disparity in the state. And I guess one of the questions are there things we can do for the middle class? I mean, if you think of the typical middle class household, if they were here before, they've got this nice nest egg and they're going to cash it in and they're probably going to leave the state. Their children are not going to cash in that nest egg unless they go to college, in which case they'll get part of the mortgage. But they're not going to be able to afford a house. And then you have the folks who are middle class who are buying into this market who are so incredibly burdened by debt, by the cost of their housing, that their quality of life is seriously affected. And so the question is, are there any areas, I mean, we've talked a lot about kind of the low-end affordable part and kind of what's going on at the top when we talk about Malibu and Beverly Hills and places like that. But are there things we can target in that middle?
Yeah, I'll proffer an idea. One of the things that keeps us from doing more strategic partnerships with for-profit developers is the California State Board of Equalization's welfare exemption, which is a property tax bonus to those that build low-income affordable housing, doesn't exist for that mid-market opportunity. So if you have a low-income housing tax credit, a LIHTC deal that is generally, between 30 and 80% area median income, you get and it's 100% used in that way, the developer gets a property tax exemption, which is a huge ability. It really helps to bridge the gap on the cost of operating expenses and the shortfall in terms of acquisition and construction of affordable housing in California. If the Board of Equalization could look at raising that limit, we could look at housing opportunities for what's called workforce housing, which is between 120% area median income to 160% area median income. And if we could have a qualified exemption relating to the proportion, or using proportionality, and this is for the grad students here who are much smarter than I am to figure out, but the formula could be driven by how much of an incentive is then being offered to the state to house those who otherwise don't have access to the economic or workforce housing opportunities. And it's really something that we should be looking at the state level to do that. The ability for us to partner more with nonprofits that understand, we're specialists in being able to income qualify a renter. It's a difficult process. You have to ask for documents. You have to engage in a really confidential conversation that most developers don't and landlords don't want to deal with. Can you pay the rent? Good, move in. I've checked your credit. I don't want to know if your son or daughter has income. I don't want to get a copy of your tax returns for the past 4 years. I mean, it's an extensive process, but if we could do more partnerships with the for-profit side that would allow for that property tax exemption, I bet you would see, given that we don't have inclusionary zoning in the state, right? I think you would see affordability for some of the market rate units that are being developed, add in a few or more affordable units at that workforce housing level.
I want to say too, for the middle class and that, or the lower middle class, I'll speak more on that end because that's where I belong. If I were to be incentivized, that's nice. That's what I need. I need that break. I need that help, if you will, that service. The city's lost a lot when Governor Brown eliminated redevelopment. We did, and I didn't realize how big a tool that was. And I met Jerry. He helped me get the big C out of Bell, in a big fashion. But I wish I would have talked about housing at the time, frankly, because he never returned my calls anymore. But I feel that if we could do something like redevelopment that goes directly to the would-be homeowner, that, from a government perspective, from a policy perspective, that would really resonate. We need to bring something like that back. We have tiny houses in Bell that are coming in the private sector, and it's all good. We have zoned it correctly. We had to redo a lot of things. General plan, I had it with me, and zoning, but it was easy in Bell to do. It doesn't take that long in a small city. It shouldn't take that long. I know there's grad students out here and professionals. If I may, Michael, can I just shamelessly give a promotion to my city? We're needing a housing manager. Please go and apply at City Hall. We need one now, okay? Thank you.
So we've had lots of job offers on this panel.
Yeah,
Let's
that's
do that.
right.
James?
I'm always skeptical when people talk about funding for housing because it takes a minimum of $100,000, and that's a very generous minimum to produce a unit, right? So if you're talking about $800 million, you're not talking about that many units, and you're never talking about $800 million. So it has to be a systematic change. Funding, yeah, it's great, and funding is great for transit especially, but that's the funding is never going to solve the problem. A problem or a solution like that, you know, some of the ones that have been described already are. But from my perspective, I was coming of age as a journalist right when redevelopment was getting axed. The state's doing better now than it was then. And I'm a renter, so I don't need any more equity for homeowners. And so,
Well, if you had kids, you'd look at it differently.
yeah, if I was a politician, I'd look at it differently.
Well,
I
no,
think it's-
roots. It's about roots. Homes is about roots.
No, I agree. Yeah, my home is great. 450 square feet in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, with 3. Anyway, okay, I'm getting sidetracked. I think redevelopment was not a panacea, and the solutions that have been put forward since then are also half-baked measures. The enhanced infrastructure financing district hasn't actually been implemented anywhere. That's one of the supposed replacement tools for redevelopment financing in the state. It's an idea that has literally never been implemented. The county has control of signing that off, and the county never signs off on that. So it's a systematic problem, and it needs a systematic solution. It's not going to be, the solution's not going to come from tax increment, and it's not going to come from Department of Defense funding either.
Are there tools that we haven't touched on? I mean, we've talked about incentives. I assume those come from some sort of special funds and general fund allocations. But are there other tools that we've overlooked in this conversation from the broader economic development domain that could hook housing to it?
Be wary of opportunity zones. That was in the GOP tax reform bill, and that's what a lot of people are pushing as the next solution in this area. And it's incredibly problematic which areas have been assigned as opportunity zones, and there's very much in question about who's going to benefit from these. That's the big one. You know, the last Trump budget proposed cutting the community development block grants entirely, and as I mentioned, the EIFDs are completely ineffective. So that leaves us opportunity zones, and it's very much something that you have to be skeptical about.
We see opportunity zones as opportunity. We're kind of excited about them to see how that might work, given the lack of funding. I mean, again, I've got to make a beautiful vision from crumbs in the affordable housing industry, and so beautiful vision I will make. We are looking forward to seeing how we can do place-based investment strategies around where opportunity zones exist. You know, we also had promise, right? And there are other foundations that do place-based strategies, but we really are looking at opportunity zones as a way of recruiting dollars and economic investment into areas of severe disinvestment and neglect, historical neglect. So we are not we're not so upset about it as of yet.
Opportunities in the city of Bell, and we're a city where we were handed lemons, we had to make lemonade. And when we saw a few of the council and activists, you know, with the Bell Resident Club, when we saw an empty lot, when we saw a vacant building, we figured right away, why can't we do something there? So for us, vacant lots, the despair of the neglect in our city is opportunity. And we just have to have the community behind us, and therefore the political will that comes with it. It would, if you could engage the community properly. You know, Pete, shout out to him. He helped me with the civic engagement before the scandal in Bell. And I love him. He's a Republican, but I still love him. This is what our community sees in an empty lot. You know, we're either going to get parks or we're going to get affordable housing. And either of those two things will work in a community like Bell.
All right, well, we have some questions from the audience for the panel here. And I guess this first one, and this is one that actually kind of resonates with some of my thinking. In full disclosure, I was part of the team in Houston that was working on the project that became the Center for Opportunity Urbanism. And so the principle of that kind of approach is that it's the overall economy and kind of free markets that will drive some of these things. And Houston's notorious or famous or infamous for not having a lot of zoning regulation. And a lot of the conversations we've had today are about kind of deregulating California zoning practice, whether it's creating entitlements or whether it's upsizing density or whatever the approach is. And so one of the questions that comes, and I think, you know, if you think of universities, for example, somebody asked earlier where our housing is for our students. We have dorms across the street. There's faculty housing on campus. And that was despite the California Coastal Commission's best efforts. You know, this is a setting where employers can play an important role. So this question talks about how do we incentivize on a state, federal, or local level private developers to partner with government or with other organizations to provide housing for the workforce. So I will throw that out there.
For me, it's Board of Equalization. Property tax exemptions, raise the limit to go higher, allow us to create workforce mixed-use developments in with some of the developments that are going to be driven by the market at market rate, and I think we would get more naturally occurring affordable housing.
And just to add that, I think generally when we talk about affordable housing, it's very, there's a lot of confusion because we're really talking about two separate, although interrelated problems. Problem number one is how do we lower keep the median rent or median housing costs down so that more people can buy housing or rent housing on their own without government support. And then problem number two is, given that rents will always be above zero, how do we help the people who are always going to, whatever the rent level, are going to need government support? And sometimes, and the answer to one problem is not necessarily the answer to the other.
In the city of Bell, I would have to say, and this is a theme that I'm hearing, is get out of regulation or minimize it. In my case, we need to revamp it. Our housing is contingent on our RHNA. Let me spell that out for you. Regional Housing Needs Assessment from the LA County. And it puts us in a bad situation when we do that assessment in the city of Bell. It doesn't really speak out to disadvantaged communities like the city of Bell. So I would like to see RHNA revamp. That whole policy is very restrictive for us to create affordable housing in our communities.
I think that one of the questions that came out of this morning's conversation talked about that, right? In fact, that planning process really has no teeth. There's no enforcement, and to the extent it's there, it's very confining. And so that was one of the areas that people talked about for deregulation. Part of our conversation turned to the possibility of new programming, maybe not redevelopment agencies, but other kinds of incentive organizations. And I've got two questions here that talk about, they phrase it as corruption, but it's really the corruption as Rick Cole was talking about at lunch. It's this process that requires you to invest lots and lots of resources to get the right political associations in place to get your project through if you want to get an entitlement to do something. And so I guess the question is, are there ways of addressing that as we think about building new instruments or new mechanisms for investing in these areas, assuming the money comes, which is kind of this pile of questions. Assuming the money comes, are there things that we need to think about putting in place that either streamline that or put the right protections in place to prevent actual corruption along the way?
I've got some thoughts on that, Michael. I think aside from zoning by right, because we've talked about that, where we can get around that municipal process that creates the litigation and the holdup. I think localities and the state could adopt a sense of needing to move as though our hair were on fire. I think we need to get out of the way unless we can identify that we are blocking something, because that's what we do. We tie ourselves to preservation, historical preservation, or environmental preservation, and even those industry forerunners, I think, also need to acknowledge that our priority has to be building housing. And so I think at the state level and localities, I think each department, whether it's the fire department or HCD at the state, needs to identify its 10 principles for encouraging affordable housing or building more housing. I think as a mandate, that's what we need to do, so that everyone is on the same page. Because if we can't get zoning by right, or if we're getting there over time, we still have this need for hundreds of thousands of units. And it makes us feel, our conversations at the board level and with public are, what can we do to get out of our own way, to build more quickly, more efficiently, and to stay on target, that the goal is to house people, to provide the dignity of a home. And so I would think one of the things that cities could do is identify each department, to what extent do you touch on this issue for a regulation or for oversight, or in what way do you interact on the issue, and identify the threshold top 10, top 5 things you can do to get out of the way of building housing. And I think we really need to act as though the crisis is in front of us, and not that the crisis is coming or that it doesn't affect us deeply and personally. There are people beyond this room who will not have the ability to reach their families for 2 hours after they leave their service job at Pepperdine tonight. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people that need housing, and we need to act that way and get out of the way. I don't know how better to say it.
So everybody being zoning experts here in the room knows what a community planning implementation overlay is, right? Yeah. So, when you pass a community plan, that doesn't actually affect any of the zoning code changes that are set forth by the plan. You have to have a community plan implementation overlay. Richard Bruckner is nodding with me, so I'm right on this one. A specific plan can also implement zoning changes, but the point is these community plans for decades now have laid out visions that had no power to actually achieve any of those plans. You needed another process to do that. And so that's why I started by talking about zoning code reform in the city of Los Angeles. Supposedly, we're going to recouple those processes, and now the new community plans will include the new zoning code. So the potential, and that's why I think it's important to watch this. It seems Byzantine and it seems very difficult to understand, but people have to watch this and start to evaluate the results of what's happening with the planning processes in the city of Los Angeles if we want to achieve a more equitable society and a more equitable housing market. Because that's what's being promised us right now, is that this process is going to deliver those things.
I think that one of the things that comes to my mind is to kind of bring this panel to a conclusion, because we've run out of time.
Michael, can I say it just really
sure.
quick? Because the big C speaks very loudly to me, right? The C in corruption. We, as an elected official, and anywhere, frankly, we're just human. In my tenure as an elected official, someone pushed over $4,000 in front of me, cash. Someone else gave me a $1,000 contribution because they wanted live music in their bar. We could easily say yes to that, and much harder say, oh no, I'm out of here. I do the hard way. I walked away, I stepped out, and they even said to me, don't you need $4,000? And I said, not from you. It's very hard to do that because they will find someone else and they will let you out. I want to say to that, there is a positive to get rid of that pressure for a contractor or someone who has vision to come in and they have to work through all those, ins and outs of politics and the sad part of politics. It's civic engagement. Our policymakers need to engage the community more. That makes it more transparent, and honestly, it makes it honest. When you have people, stakeholders, that on some cases are incentivized by giving them a cup of coffee, or some tacos to come in and listen to a hearing or listen to a presentation. And in Bell, we had to do this. We, outside of our council meetings, we invited people to come and just have a discussion about this plan, about that plan. If we could do civic engagement, if we could put our policy makers to engage that community more, you're going to find a special interest in our community.
Thank you. I think that there's this narrow line of how much public access and how quick can you make the process, right? And I think that's one of the challenges we have to craft. I will say in the area of housing, I think this is a unique and remarkable time, and we have to strike now if we want to make long-term investments. I mean, I lived in the Bay Area in 2000 when the dot-com bubble burst and housing values collapsed quickly. And the interest in affordable housing or housing supply disappeared overnight. The same thing again in 2009. And I think what we're seeing right now is a unique window in California to take on a problem that, quite frankly, we've been ignoring for 40 or 50 years. And I think that's something that it sets a great stage for our next session, which I think Dean Peterson is going to tell us will start in 5 minutes.
Yes. Yes. So we're going to break. Let's have a